So welcome everybody back to the second part of SymposiumX. We are very honored to have very distinguished speakers here to talk about security, identity, privacy, and also in relations to the emerging innovations in payments. And let me ask speakers to introduce yourself.
My name is Rouven. I work for a company called ConsenSys. We're a Brooklyn-based startup focusing on blockchain. Like our main platform we're supporting is Ethereum, and we're building. Should I go into the company already,
yes,
or just talk about?
Can you describe your products
Sure.
and please do describe your products and services?
So briefly, my background: I used to work in tech in Deutsche Bank for over a decade. ConsenSys is one of the biggest players in the blockchain market. We started 4 years ago, which was kind of early, and we're one of the pure blockchain players. What we're doing is 5 different components. So we're building all kind of products around the space. So imagine there's this new Web3 ecosystem, and there are no websites, no tools, and so we're building all kind of tools for developers as well as the products on top. We noticed that a lot of people were very interested in this and understanding what that means for enterprises, governments, and others. So we got approached a lot, and we started to educate. So we did a lot of consulting. So we have now 200 people who are just doing consulting services for enterprises and governments. Then we noticed that it's such a new technology that there's a lot of educational gaps. So we started to build a lot of on our own academy and doing a lot of trainings. We have Coursera courses and other things. So really to get developers to understand the technology better and building applications on top. Then we have what we call more products around the capital markets, so where we help on tokenization of assets and then help people to get familiar on-ramps, off-ramps into this crypto space. And the 5th one I will remember in a second. So yeah, that's kind of our space, and yeah.
We'll come back to you.
Thank
There's
you.
a lot to talk about Web 3.0 and Ethereum.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Dave?
Good. David Benoit, I'm with Reach and Chief Technology Officer there. Also very responsible and interested in security matters, privacy, identity management, that kind of thing. We work in the space between localization and payments and foreign exchange. We move money around for people more efficiently to facilitate payments. There's a lot of interesting problems that come up with this world. There's lots of regulatory aspects that we have to deal with in terms of just payment card industry stuff, but also in money laundering and other realms. But there's also a lot of things to do around fraud and detection there as well. So I'm really interested in making this stuff easier for merchants to do right, so that the customers are protected and the merchants aren't exposed.
Definitely, we'll come back to you on the regulation piece, right? Ben?
Sure. So my name is Ben Isaacson. I'm a Senior Vice President at the Clearinghouse. So the Clearinghouse is a consortium of 25 of the top largest banks in the country, and it's where they get together to solve industry problems. So many of those industry problems are things like payment systems. So the Clearinghouse is building out the new real-time payment system in the U.S., as well as manage existing large payment systems like chips where the wires are moved. EPN, where ACH is moved back and forth. My initiative is called Connected Banking, and it's really looking at, similar to kind of the things like PSD2 and UK open banking in Europe. We're looking at how do we better give consumers control over their data, as in terms of how they're sharing bank data with fintechs, data aggregators, and others in the ecosystem, ultimately to enable safe innovation, as fintech usage grows.
Thank you, Ben. Wendy?
Thanks. Wendy Seltzer, Counsel and Strategy Lead for the World Wide Web Consortium. Alan told you about W3C, so I don't need to repeat that, and can dig into the things that I do in my day-to-day. So with my lawyer hat on, I work on preserving our royalty-free patent policy, helping make sure that everyone can implement the technologies being developed and standardized at W3C. And other legal agreements around that, making sure that this technology is really worldwide and accessible to all. And then as strategy lead, I'm looking out for where the web is going next, what technologies are getting to the point where there's critical mass for standardization, where there are pieces that should be interoperating but aren't, things that could be made easier if there were a common platform, and some of the exciting developments like web authentication come from, just a few years ago we were sitting there thinking authentication should be easier and we need to kill off the password. We've got a standard for that now, and I hope we will see widespread implementation that makes it easier and more secure for users and applications at the same time. I also have a strong interest in security, privacy, and some of the new work coming forward. We may talk about the Decentralized Identifiers proposal that's before us as a draft charter as well.
Thank you, Wendy. So the next question to the panel is, what are the lessons that you have learned that you can share with all of us? And what are some of your lessons, some of your successes?
So
Yes.
I start?
Yeah.
I think, to be honest, I think our company is quite a bit different because we are a startup itself. So I think it's not, when I used to work at Deutsche Bank, we had our innovation offices and other things. So I think now our company is trying to be very different in the way how we operate as a company. So we have, we try to have no to as very little hierarchy as possible, being very innovative, spin up new projects, set the right incentive for teams to run fast, fail fast. So I'm not quite sure whether it's so applicable in the same way how some of the colleagues are here on the panel are doing this, because we are in such an early space, so that we all, try new things very fast. We have changed teams. I'm working on an identity solution, which over the last 3.5 years has changed so much because the ecosystem has evolved so many times. So I think staying really agile of understanding what the market does and collaborating across the company as well as with the market is just extremely important. But it's also in our DNA from the very beginning, because I guess we are a new company, so it's a bit different.
I'm very interested to know whether you can explain what Web 3.0 means to ConsenSys, right? And what does Ethereum, right? How do you work with it? Perhaps you can enlighten all of us.
So I think many people heard about blockchains in general. The main innovation we are excited about is not necessarily just that you have Bitcoin, you can move and pay something with it. I think Ethereum is a platform where you can run application code in a, let's say, with a different trust model. So today you have companies who run computers where you have certain logic and they execute this code. But you need to trust these companies or consortiums or groups of entities, and they have brands and other reasons why you can trust them. What we are building now is like the internet has helped us to communicate with anyone, anywhere in the world in a very frictionless way. We are now building technology where you can deploy application logic for programmable money, for any kind of logic to say, if this happens, then this other next step will happen too. And the fact that it is something which is stored basically on the blockchain means that nobody can later change the rules. So the application itself is somewhere available in this big network. And that's why it's quite interesting, because people can interact with this platform now without trusting any of the operators, because the system itself, and without going into technical details, cryptographic and math and economics around this, make it robust to can trust it. So that's kind of the very bigger picture. And Web3 is what we call also other layers of like decentralized technologies, where you have technology like IPFS, which is like a file system, which is decentralized, and other layers where you can build like the next generation of the internet. That's what we call it. And I'm working on a initiative which is called like Decentralized Identity or Self-Sovereign Identity, using the technology to build identity systems which are not anymore in a traditional identity provider where you need to trust either Google, Facebook, or like another third party, but you use a combination of keys and blockchain to secure this and give more control to the users itself.
Fascinating. Dave, would you like to share your lessons and successes that you have learned?
Sure. Lesson number one, how to turn on the microphone. In this space, I think one of the things that we've learned is that this world of finance, of e-commerce, and protecting data around that, it doesn't seem to be evolving at the pace that I think it should. There's a lot of legacy systems that exist that I think will exist as long as those players have skin in the game, as long as there is billions and trillions of dollars being transacted on those platforms. Those things will resist innovation. And that's not saying innovation isn't happening, because it is. There's lots of innovative payment methods and ways to move money between different parties. But there's a lot of inertia that's here. And disrupting the space in the way that we want to do that is really working against the system. So I think one of the things that we can count as a good success is that we are actually able to make movement in this area, despite not having trillions of dollars that's backing us, or the 50 years of history that's going with these networks. That we are making progress, and small companies and innovative players are able to make change.
I'm interested to know your point of view, if the regulators are chasing after the innovation, or the innovation is catching up with the regulations?
I'd say that it's a bit of both. From my perspective, I think that the regulations around things like privacy and security are not tight enough. I don't think that it's really a tractable problem for people to get their head around what really needs to be done to protect their information. They just know that, we talked about the strength of passwords and how ridiculous it is to make up these things. And what's funny is people think of that as a reasonable thing to do, but it's completely wrong. So I think the regulations sort of are the same. We have regulators that make up rules without really understanding the underlying systems that they're trying to regulate. And then you have people coming in to disrupt these areas that want to innovate, that want to change things, and you go up against a simple regulation in something like PCI that says your passwords need to be 10 characters and they need to have these crazy symbols in them and all that stuff, and you're like, but why? I can prove to you that this other system is better. And they're like, I don't care. So working against that kind of thing is very difficult, very frustrating.
Thank you, Dave. Ben?
Yeah, so in terms of, I guess, both lessons and successes, and I'm going to actually piggyback on some of your points, where we at the Clearinghouse have found the most success is where we've developed private sector solutions, but work very closely alongside the regulators to understand kind of the spirit and principles behind what they're trying to accomplish. So our view, and the reason why we're looking at things like connected banking as a private sector alternative to regulation, is, I think Mark said it great, earlier on, was, regulators, their heart's in the right place. They really, they want to do the right thing, but the challenge is they don't run payment systems or banking systems every day, right? So if they get 80% of it right, that's a lot of edge cases, a lot of detail where mistakes have been made. And the challenge with regulation is once you've made a law, you can't just change it on a dime, right? It actually takes a long time to change. So where we've been the most successful is actually building relationships with the regulators where we get out in front of them before it's even a law and they're even thinking about it. We're talking to them and working with them to figure out, number one, what are they trying to accomplish and helping, understanding what they're trying to accomplish. And that's kind of the heart's in the right place, right? So once you get that, then you can start to work through, as an industry, what are the things that can be done to address it, to address those things, but in a practical way. And, so when we've done both of those things, that's what gives us, on our good days, the ability to go be successful and make meaningful change in an area, in an ecosystem as highly complex and regulated as, the United States banking and payment systems.
Can I add something? I think I agree. I think the interesting part was like this whole blockchain and crypto stuff. There's a lot of like confusion, a lot of misunderstandings, and I think in the beginning there was more, let's say, resistance against like the support. But then there's a certain level, I think, of like regulatory arbitrage between certain jurisdictions in other countries where like, hey, come here, like we give you more certainty, and there's a lot of like. At the moment, people are issuing securities on blockchains, so lots of the European or like Liechtenstein and smaller Singapore, others are building really, I think, earlier frameworks. They can maybe move a bit faster, but then it's also like a very different environment. So I think what we have seen in the last 2 years is that there's a lot of openness with most of the regulators, also here in the US, of course. And so the dialogue is very active and I think very positive. So I think, as you mentioned, there's a lot of educational things happening, a bit of like a lot of misunderstandings to clarify, because most of them are actually interested to allow innovation to happen without, I don't know, destroying things, or like without like protecting obviously consumers and businesses, but like finding the right balance, I think, is the interesting part.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you. Wendy, would you want to share your lesson and successes?
Sure. So at W3C, I think we see success as bringing community together to achieve what members want, and finding consensus, a core value baked into the structure of the web and its standards is consensus. Now, consensus isn't unanimity, but it means nobody has a strong and sustained objection that hasn't been addressed. So when we look at different technologies as they're developing, we're looking at what can get that consensus. Where can everyone agree, everyone participating in the ecosystem, that they're better off if this standard exists and is interoperable. It doesn't mean that everything needs to be homogeneous. There are extension points to standards. There are pieces that standards enable as platforms for building an innovation above, and finding the right level to standardize, the right level of abstraction, the right interfaces that let people build cool technologies underneath and cool technologies above, and all meet together at this interface is sort of the key point to finding that consensus. So in web authentication, I think we've done that. We've found a standard interface that enables device authenticators and plug-in authenticators and biometric authenticators and client-based authenticators to experiment and innovate with what will be easiest for users, what will be most convenient, what will meet the levels of security demanded by various applications and services. And then we've said, great, do that. Here's an interface that you can speak to the client through, that you can speak to the server through. and let's see what develops there. And then we shipped a recommendation, version 1, so that's a standard that people can use and can refer to and build developments upon, and immediately went into work on version 2, which is, okay, what did we have to leave out in order to ship this recommendation? What pieces weren't we sure about yet? Where couldn't we find consensus for V1, but we think there might be more work to do and more ways to move forward. And so, conversations continue in the working group. The work doesn't end when we ship a recommendation. So I think that there's, a lot happening there. A standard that's at a slightly earlier stage. The Web Payments Working Group is working on their Payments Request API, and that one's at the candidate recommendation phase. So in W3C speak, candidate recommendation is where we think we've got the final design, but we need to rigorously test out the implementations. We need to see, how does this work in practice? Who's implementing it? What are the problems that they might face? Is it clear enough? Can implementers figure it out so that multiple different implementations interoperate? It doesn't help if two people read the same spec and read it differently, and even though both of them think they're implementing something, they don't work together. That's not a standard. So at the CR phase, they're testing that, or building test suites and building implementations, and seeing how they match up and confirming, do we have the right design? Does it meet all of our horizontal review criteria? Is it accessible to people with disabilities and of all abilities? Is it internationalized so that it can be used around the world? Is it secure? Is it privacy preserving? And all of those go into the review and consideration as the Payment Request API moves its way forward to recommendation.
Thank you, Wendy. Would you like to share with us the collaboration with FIDO and Vico? Wendy, this, yeah.
Sure, and so we have a few different ways that we collaborate with other standards organizations. FIDO was a key partner in bringing the initial drafts of web authentication to us, and helping bring their membership to work on the web authentication spec. And then we've more recently launched a Web Payment Security Interest Group, which is a unique new collaboration among W3C, FIDO, and EMVCO, where the memberships of all three of those organizations are invited to come together in a members-only forum to discuss, how do the standards of these three bodies intersect? Are there places where, one organization needs to sort of hand off to another organization to make sure that work interoperates among them? So that we can meet the secure payment requirements of EMVCO, the secure authentication requirements in FIDO, the web security requirements at W3C, and find sort of the right home for further development of pieces of the stack. We often, in web technologies, talk about the web stack. It's not, a monolithic, here you've got your web. It's a whole bunch of components fitting together, and each of those standards organizations and other organizations make some components of that, and we want to make sure that developments of all of those are well harmonized and understand the requirements that participants from different sectors bring to the table.
Thank you, Wendy. The next question to the panel is, what do you think are the most critical needs or challenges facing your industry? So, Rouven.
It's always me first.
Yeah. you want maybe you can toss it, yeah? Who wants to go first?
So I think the biggest needs for now, there's a bunch of, okay, there are multiple differences. I think one of them is the technology maturity is one piece which is still, I think, evolving fast. There's a lot of things where people talk about privacy issues with blockchains. There's a lot of concerns about scaling. There's a lot of misunderstandings. I think the evolution of where the industry already is not necessarily where the understanding of like normal people is, like what either the last 6 to 12 months of innovation have already done in the space. So this leads to like a lot of educational work is required. And because blockchain is not like, I know maybe 2 or 3 years ago, everyone's like, oh, we solve everything with blockchain. I think people realize that blockchain has certain things you can do with it very well. And I think some of them are, let's say identity is very interesting. Many people are very excited about the possibilities there. And tokenization of any kind of assets is one of the other, like I think, big use cases we see a lot of traction on. And both of them are required to fit into a good framework of legal and regulatory things. So I think working on these 3 different elements is what I think the situation is today. And I think making people more comfortable by actually building technology which people can touch and feel. And it's not anymore this fuzzy slides people are showing around and talking about, but actually demonstrating how things can be implemented.
So related to that, how would you manifest identity? It's a loaded question.
So identity, I think, we talked about this partly here. I think even the definition of what identity means is very broad for many different people. When I think about this, it's often like an identifier, like you are controlling something, and it is about the data and interactions and relationship to that. So over time, interacting with my bank, with my friends, with others, I'm collecting a lot of data points, and if I do this in a way that it's all verifiable, so I'm talking to my bank and they attest that I have an account, I go to my employer, they attest that I'm this, and it is all cryptographically signed. It doesn't need to be on the blockchain, it just needs to be cryptographically signed, and therefore you create a lot of trust because you can always verify who was the issuer, and because it was cryptographically signed, it's not anymore tampered. So I have now an ability to use my identity, which is this combination of all kind of data points, verified data points, plus the ability that I can prove that I'm the holder of this identity. And I can share this in a very almost frictionless way with third parties, whether it's a website, whether it's me entering a certain location, and I can share a whole set where the receiving party can immediately verify that all of this data is correct. This is changing the paradigm of like how I think we can interact and bridge this gap between today, most of the identity things are like very service-centric. So I have an identity with my bank account, I have an identity with Facebook, I have an identity with all the different providers. And everywhere I start with a username, password, or with my enrollment of X or KYC, I go through all of this again and again. And if we do this more user-centric, I think that opens up a lot of possibilities. And the second element to that is, now this is a big topic, is about data management. It's about like me holding not only this verifiable data, but let's say any data which, whether it's my preferences, whether it is my history of shopping, whatever it is. So there's a lot of people in the industry working on specifications amongst different players, and we have really big names who are really actively working in the space, not just some startups, but also IBM, Microsoft, MasterCard, and others are really like very active in the space. Because ultimately shifting the model from Facebook, Google, and Amazon holding all my data and all my history into a more user-centric model will, I think, change the dynamics in the marketplace again, and that's quite interesting for many companies.
Thank you, Rouven. Dave, would you like to comment on the critical needs or challenges for innovation?
Sure. I think one of the biggest things that I think about is I think a lot of people in this room understand private information versus public information. I think that we didn't so much grow up in an environment where pretty much your entire life was public. I think more about my kids' generations to follow, where they don't even know what private information really is, and what information from payments or financial or anything like that. Where is the line? Like what should they be sharing? What should they not be sharing? And if a merchant, is asking for something, is that okay? Is it not okay? Like, how do you know? How does my 15-year-old even know how to buy something online? The only access she has to money right now is cash. And you transition immediately into a digital economy. Like, I think the industry there has to set things up so that it's easy for that next group of people coming online for payments to do it the right way. You know, we may not have gotten it right. We may have cumbersome payment methods and cumbersome forms of moving money around, but we, I think, have a real big challenge that we have a whole bunch of people that are just like, I just want somebody else to deal with that. I just want this thing to come into my house, and I don't really care about the details of how it got here or what had to happen to make that work. I don't care about logistics. I don't care. It just needs to get here. But we as the industry have to make sure that that actually happens without damaging people.
How would you describe the global user needs in terms of, are there user requirements in the different parts of the world? How, would it impact further, making it more challenging, more for what you just described?
I think there's a huge challenge there. I think in Western economies, we're very used to having access to these technologies that makes these things kind of easy. But even in this environment, we have very big discrepancies between people that have access and people that do not. I mean, if you have a cell phone plan, if you have a data plan, and you have a credit card, you have very good access to buy pretty much anything you want. If you're a low-income person who only gets their internet access through public access points at libraries, and you can't even afford a phone, you've got big disparity there. Now you move into emerging markets where that might be, instead of a small segment of the population, a large part of the population. Or you move into a market where payments are just completely different. They're more peer-to-peer. They're more community-based. The models don't hold universally.
Thank you. Then, coming back to you, yeah? What are the challenges and needs?
So I would echo some of the earlier comments thinking around.
Sorry, your mic's not working. You want to just borrow somebody's there?
Sorry. So yeah, I would echo some of the earlier comments around kind of, you know something we're facing a lot in banking and payments that's really kind of impacting innovation in general is just the big challenge of legacy infrastructure. Not just payment systems, but core banking systems. You know, these were all things that were built in the 1970s and 80s. And now what you're looking at is this next generation of fintech apps, technology that's sitting on a rotten core or an old core, right? And kind of the way that works is really challenging and kind of manifests itself in a lot of ways that can really be, fundamentally unsafe. So let me give you an example. How many of you use fintech apps today? A Mint.com, Acorns, whatever, right? How many of you, when you use those apps, have given that app your bank username and password? No one's raising their hand. You all did. You probably don't even remember you did. Out of those people, how many of you have actually read the terms and conditions on that fintech app? Yeah, it's so what you have is you have technology that there's a couple of things happening here, right? So these apps that are valued at billions of dollars and gets a lot of Silicon Valley investment, they're creating kind of front-end workarounds on old platforms, right? So here's how this happens, right? So that fintech app, which you've just given your username and password to, either does it themselves or hires, a data aggregator to create a bot to go in and screen scrape all the data out of your bank account, right? So 20, 30, 40 times a day, they go into your bank account and they get all the information they need to kind of create the service that you want through that app, right? These companies aren't regulated. many of them are quite small. You know, their data team is a couple of people, right? And you're trusting the keys to all your money with these people. My belief is that is a ticking time bomb. You know, they're, you know, and the problem, and I'll go back to a point you made, all the users who have clicked on these terms and conditions basically say, we can get any data we want, and if anything bad happens to it, your fault. And you don't know that because you haven't read it. And we did a bunch of research. Most consumers actually think, they don't actually know what happens if something goes wrong. You know, many of them think the bank's going to take care of it.
Rouven, you want to jump on
Yes.
that?
No, I like it. I think the combination of what you mentioned in terms of most people are not aware, maybe they don't care. I think the lack of awareness of what privacy actually means, maybe for your later life or for implications of being manipulated, whatever. I think what GDPR is doing, I think whilst people might not like it in many aspects, I think setting the rules to make sure privacy by design is implemented, so you cannot override with your terms and conditions like, oh sure, give me all the data, that you basically empower the users who might not understand all the necessary details. And I think it sparks a lot of discussion, which is good. It sparks also some innovation, and it challenges some of these models, which I think is generally a good thing. Whether everything is perfect in this, surely not. But let's say I think it's a healthy thing for our digital ecosystem to have this challenging piece of legislation.
Thank you, Rouven. But I would like to also ask Ben further, given your work on connected banking, would you like to share with the audience about the concept of open banking, open API, and maybe also share the light, what does API means? I know that all of us know what is API, but for the audience, what does really opening up the API really means? What are the impacts? Yeah?
Sure. So, you know, so the way we're thinking about the solution to some of these problems, like, you know, giving your bank credentials to, you know, non-regulated small companies, is allowing kind of direct connections between the bank and either the fintech or a data aggregator who would be a stand-in for that. And these direct connections are what an API is. And what the API enables is, you know, so the path that we're trying to create is, instead of you giving your username and credentials to this company, when you go onto your fintech app, you would click within the app, you know, automatically porting into your bank account to put in the username and credentials yourself. So, you know, you never have to give them to a third party. You would use it with your bank just like you do every time you do online banking. That bank would store the permission you've granted that said, okay, that fintech app can get access to just my checking account, right? They can't see my mortgage data. They don't need my mortgage data. They can't go get my social security number, which is in there. They don't need that. We want to show them their checking account data. We can show them that. And you know, so the ability to enable that, have that kind of stored centrally, you know, within the bank. Will enable, you know, a much safer environment in terms of access to the data. What it also enables is the ability for consumers to control what data is shared. We did some other research, and you know, so for the same people who signed up for this fintech app, 6 months later, when you decided you never used it and it sounded like a good idea at the time, you deleted the app. You know what happens? That company still keeps getting your data every day, because deleting the app doesn't actually stop them from getting the data. So, you know, the other piece to giving consumers control of this is having somewhere on your bank website the ability to see who's actually accessing your bank account. And you can say, okay, these 5 fintech apps are accessing my bank account. These 4 I remember, I use them every day, they're great apps. Yeah, that's perfect. This last one, I deleted it 3 years ago. What's it still doing getting my data? I'm going to shut that off. So having the ability not just to control, you know, so these direct connections between the bank and the fintech, or the bank and the data aggregator, will allow, you know, both, you know, on one hand, the passwords not to be shared. That's number one. And then number two, enabling consumers to on an ongoing basis to manage who's getting access to their data. Because if you do it right, the innovation that's coming out of these fintech apps are phenomenal, right? And, there's a reason why, I was looking on the App Store the other day. There's 25 fintech apps right now with over 1 million downloads on the Google Play Store, right? So they're obviously doing something right, and they're creating value, and we want to enable that, but we want to do it in a safe way that doesn't, jeopardize, people's money.
Thank you, Ben. Wendy, what are the challenges and needs?
First, the challenge of getting a microphone that works. So I think privacy is one of the real challenges to work in a consensus-based standards organization, because there are, frankly, some orgs that thrive on collecting as much data as they can from users, and others that are trying to protect users' privacy, think that they're on different sides of that problem, and trying to find ways that the technology can help users to control their data is, on that level, a challenge. Now, I think that that conflict is not so deep as it seems, because ultimately all of our industries, whatever industry you're in, depends on the trust of end users to survive. If end users stop trusting that the internet is a place that they can go without having data slurped from them right and left, they'll stop using all of the applications that they use. They'll stop being exposed to advertisements. They'll stop using e-commerce. They'll stop making online transactions, and none of our businesses will survive. So to win back that trust, which is eroding from the disclosures of data breaches and unanticipated data leakages day by day, I think we need to come together with a shared commitment that, we won't use the dark patterns that suck users into giving more consent than they meant to, or keep taking data from them after they think they've left, but rather make it easy for people to see what data they're giving, to choose what data they're giving, to get frequent checkups on, is the picture I'm presenting in fact the picture that I want to be presenting of my activities, and to build good privacy practices in from the start. So some of that we can do or help to do at W3C through privacy reviews, making sure that the interfaces and APIs that we're designing don't have unexpected privacy consequences and don't, give additional data fingerprinting surfaces. So data fingerprinting is, when you go online, your browser presents a particular image to the server that's made up of things like the browser user agent string, but also what fonts you have installed, what screen resolution you're using, other aspects that together build up a relatively unique, in many cases, picture of the individual access using that browser and machine. So we look at, as new specs come through, do they increase the fingerprinting surface area? Do they add new features by which users can be identified when they don't expect to be identified? How do we reduce that, mitigate those, privacy leakages, and make this an environment where people can trust that when they want to make a high-value transaction and want to promise to the bank that they are who they say they are, they're willing to entrust a lot of data about themselves because they know that it won't leak and it won't find its way to the e-commerce platform trying to figure out, so how much do I charge user X? Well, if I knew user X were rich and living in a mansion, I might charge one price, and if I thought user X were living in a studio apartment, I might choose a different price. nobody wants to be using that platform. People want to think and want to be correct in thinking that they have more control than that, that they're going into fair marketplaces, and we need to build into the web the tools to give individuals those choices.
Thank you, Wendy. Wendy, fascinating. Next question, what strategy would you recommend to cater to that innovation needs or challenges that you just described? So starting from Rouven again.
This dice isn't very random here.
So I think there's not too much new things.
You're standardizing the sequence.
Yeah. As I said, I think the needs, as I outlined before, we are just engaging with the different regulators. I think the strategy itself is not that different for us, that we're as a startup. For us, the whole business depends on this innovative products to be successful. So for us, it's kind of like a core thing. It's not just an innovation function we have in the company, it's the core of our company. So that's why I don't have a specific strategy.
I'm particularly interested when you talk about Web 3.0 and the Ethereum, how you function there. How do you have this connected ecosystem and a distributed intelligence system, and what strategy does a company or any players, in business, a mom and pop shop or a big company, how do they play in this? What strategy would you recommend?
Okay, so I think there are multiple ways how people can get involved in understanding the technology, because before people have an idea of what it is, I think it's hard to define the strategy for, or make a recommendation for others. So what we see is that many companies are still in this learning phase, whilst others have maybe started 3 or 4 years ago, and they are now actually starting or building, and we have built already last year, a production system, so it's happening slowly. I think there are different ways how you can get involved. So there are, like the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance is one of the industry alliances where people just get involved, and there are different working groups, whether it's tokenization on assets or whether it's discussions on supply chain, whether it's discussions on payments. So we have big banks in there. Like, how do we use this technology is very depending on the industry. For a lot of people, I think what I recommend often people is like get some of the developers in the big companies to get the head around, because yes, we can go in and we do consulting on like strategy on like, let's say, top down often, but I'd say I think what's often most interesting is that people in the community are actually very excited about the technology and understand it, because then bringing this into the I don't know, companies itself, and they know what the problems are, and if they understand better how the technology can solve this. I think the comment was made earlier, someone invented blockchain, now we're looking for some problems. But I think if people understand what the technology does well and what the technology might not do well, because people, as I said, often misunderstand how you best use this, I think educating people in the industry or in the companies itself, I think is most likely the best approach to actually get some traction.
Thank you, Rouven. Dave, yeah?
I'd say for us, the biggest sort of thing that we follow is that we are not necessarily interested in asking permission. It's not that we're intentionally trying to break the rules. It's that, and not really that the rules don't even apply. Because I think the underlying philosophy behind the rules, as was mentioned earlier, that's what you really have to get at, right? Why do these rules exist? What are they aiming to do? And once you understand that, you can think of ways to approach the problem in a different way that ultimately address the same concerns, but maybe in a different way. And that's where I think the innovation happens. It's not from taking a set of regulations or a set of rules and going, how do I build a product that meets all of these 50 pages of requirements? That's not going to be very interesting. But what you could say is, These 50 pages of requirements seem to be focused around protecting this type of information in this way for this reason. Can I make a product and can I innovate around the space that I'm in and still do those things?
I think that absolutely makes sense when the requirements and the regulations are changing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think often
Interesting.
yeah, so I think often people come with a half-baked, understood requirements document where they thought they have thought this through, instead of articulating on a high level what their problems is. And so it's like, oh yeah, we need this system, it needs to be blockchain, and this and this and this. Like, I don't know whether that makes sense necessarily, but let's say if that's what you try to achieve, we have maybe another idea how we can actually solve this. So I agree.
What about you, Ben? What do you think are the strategy you recommend?
Yeah, so I mean, when you're trying to kind of make a mass kind of migration of technology and really kind of change an ecosystem within an area that's highly regulated, there's a bunch of things you have to take on, and unfortunately for us, because it means a lot more work, because you can't really cut corners because of the nature of the businesses we're in. So there's a couple of things that are really important. So number one, if you're going to move folks away from screen scraping towards APIs, having common API standards around what you're trying to do is absolutely critical. We learned that the hard way in PSD2, where the regulators came out and said, all right, every bank, you need to offer an API for folks to get access to your data. So every bank did it. They built their own API, but they were all totally different. So every time you wanted to connect to a bank, it was actually a brand new technology build. Well, that's not a way to scale an ecosystem, right? So it was hard enough in Europe, where there's like 3 banks per market. In the US, there's 10,000 banks. So what we did, for example, in October of this year, we the clearinghouse, and along with other banks, data aggregators, and heavy users of data, built a consortium called FDX, which is focused on API standards around data sharing. So so that's number one. Number two, when you're moving towards this environment where you have connections between banks and aggregators and fintechs, banking, I've said it 100 times, I'll say it again, it's highly regulated. So once you actually have a relationship between a bank and any other party, there's a whole bunch of rules that come into place. So you need to have legal contracts, you need to have extensive third-party risk management. I don't know how many of you have gone through a bank due diligence session, but it's no fun. But it's absolutely regulatory required. It's not because banks are being jerks, right? It's because the law says you have to do it. So a lot of our work is figuring out how do you streamline those processes. So can you centralize elements of third-party risk management? Can you put out model contracts in the industry to kind of help facilitate some of this change? That's another key piece of it. And then we're looking at what infrastructure is required. When we were talking to some folks in Europe who've had to implement this, what we found is that technologists who are really good at API development, it's still kind of new. And the other part about it is, we see it here to some extent. They all want to live in like 4 cities in this country, right? And there are banks everywhere. So if you're not in like a major area that's considered a technology hub, all the really bright technologists who are on the cutting edge of development, they're not really living in your city or your town or wherever. So kind of getting that technology to scale is another area we're looking at. Are there common tool sets? Are there developer toolkits we can create that can kind of help scale the industry? So it's really when you're it comes back to really the devil being in the details, and you have to really understand all of these elements and kind of drive forward all of them, because if you don't get the legal contract right, we're hearing our banks trying to make deals, it's taking 12 to 18 months a deal, right? So how does that scale? Or if each due diligence takes 6 months and you have to do thousands of them, how does that scale? So it's really enabling all of that is the hard work that can drive this change.
Thank you, Ben. Wendy, so what are the strategy you would recommend?
Well, I would love to hear from the audience, because the strategy that I pursue a lot at W3C is trying to listen to the community and hear what it is that people are trying to do that the web can't yet do. Where do you need help from web technologies, or see something that works in one corner of the industry and you'd like to see more interoperably?
Yes, please, yeah.
Just, sorry, but if you had a blacklist of hacked biometrics and you were on that list, what would you do?
So one of the features of the web authentication architecture is that it uses biometric locally only, if at all. So you're not getting onto a central database that can be hacked. Your fingerprint is useful to unlock the local client device and nothing else. And so if that particular device falls into the wrong hands and somebody makes up a gummy finger, then they can get into your machine, but they can't get into a central service, because you can just say, no longer use this particular client authenticator, and you re-enroll your finger in a different authentication scheme. Yeah, and so for that reason, I would recommend against systems that have that kind of single point of failure. You don't want the steal it once and you've stolen it everywhere. You want systems of multiple authentication that are, can be rotated and give users, an option for recovery.
I love gummy bears. I want gummy bears fingers. No, one champagne. Anyway, the last question is, what are the tools and technologies that we can use right now? Right now that we can use for innovation. Rouven, your first one.
Again, so we are not. I think what we do in the company. So I mentioned like we operate slightly different because we want to drive like fast innovation within the company. So instead of having like a hierarchy where things bubble up after like a few months and then someone makes a decision, so we allow people to be more. Let's say self-forming of okay, we want to focus on something, but then it's chaos. Yeah. So what we have built is like an little self-organizational tool within the company where anyone can see what people are working on and start making agreements between each other. So I can now decide, okay, I want to build something cool, which I'm sure 3 of my other colleagues would consume in their application because I'm building some kind of library, which is cool, or an identity solution which other wants to use. So I would go in and first find other people, like I basically come up with an idea, find other people who say, oh yeah, that's if you build this, I will integrate this. So you can start building, let's say, bottoms-up agreements of like valuable things, because if nobody would say, I agree, I would integrate that, then nobody wants this, and then you should not do this. Obviously, you go to the market, and we're testing the market externally, but let's say if there are functions within the company, whether it is like your HR, your finance, like whatever other things, we're building this mechanisms of what we call agreements framework, so we can have this kind of mechanisms. Sounds really weird for like traditional, like where I come from a big bank. We haven't had maybe the same things, but it's one of the tools which is kind of interesting to see how you can be fast moving without, I don't know, having chaos or something. It's kind of interesting.
Thank you, Rouven. Dave, what are the tools and technologies?
I think for me, it doesn't really matter what the tools and technologies are that are behind what the innovation is. I think for us, it matters more that the end service that we're making, the end product that we're making, is useful and easy and more annoying to not use than to use. So if you think about it as wanting to default to the right solution, that's what I want to aim for. I want our customers, our partners in this business to see the value that we bring, not only in a financial way, but also in an ease of use way. That yes, it's beneficial to do this way. It has good outcomes from the books, but it's also really easy. And how we do that on the inside, it doesn't really matter as long as the presentation to the to our clients is really clean.
Thank you, Dave. Ben?
So, in terms of what can be done today, I think there's two things that I would look at. So if you are a company who touches data aggregation or kind of data sharing in financial services in any way, I would highly recommend joining the Financial Data Exchange, the consortium, because if you're gonna want to connect into a bank, into a data aggregator, you're gonna want familiarity with that standard. We've seen in Europe a lot of companies kind of taking on a lot of technical debt by building APIs that are kind of towards different standards, and so that would be one thing I would recommend right now. And then the other piece of it is, I would look to, as much as possible, to kind of modern technologies that are replacing legacy payments and banking systems. So, when you look at real-time payments, which, the clearinghouse has built out, right now there's over 50% of the DDAs in the country can accept a real-time payment. It was the first new payment infrastructure built in over 40 years, and it looks it, right? If you think about how you search for things 40 years ago, I think in my parents' house I still have an encyclopedia from whenever they bought it, right? That's kind of the way I would kind of describe, some of the older payment systems compared to the kind of the flexibility that real-time payments has. So if you are looking at payments, I would look there. And then in core banking systems, there's a lot of legacy systems out there that people are on, and migrating off of them is hard. But the new ones, after all the pain, are probably worth it. They're going to enable a lot of the flexibility that you want.
Thank you, Ben. Wendy, would you like to comment on that, tools and technologies?
I see another hand from our audience.
Oh, okay. Yes. I think the whole purpose of W3C and what you guys are bringing to the table is terrific. But I think David's points, some of the ones he made, resonate the most with me. If you look at the history and what's been going on even recently, somebody mentioned Netflix. I mean, at the end of the day, one of the reasons the Netflix model has been supported by other communities, and by the way, I short the stop, but the reason the Netflix model has been popular streaming is it's going to allow companies to take away the DVDs after they've taken away the VHSs and VCRs. Why do they want to do that? So you don't own anything. So you can't be without them for anything. And it's about control of money. And once they do that, they hike the prices, as was mentioned with Amazon. They take things off. So isn't this, what really drives innovation on the net and innovation in security, protecting our children? Isn't this all a step? And your efforts are terrific, but isn't at the end of the day what the status quo pushing it, what's going to motivate change, is only when the people funding things like, AT&T, I want you all on the internet to pay for my pipes, like the Goldman Sachs and everything, the people who are really sponsoring it, see a better way to make money from these innovations and changes, and to disenfranchise and take more power away from the individual and give more power to the oligopolies of businesses. Isn't that the only way real change in these technologies is ever going to take place on the net and security?
Well, I don't think that our only future is a future of oligopolies. I think that regulation can come back to control some of the excesses of size, and there are ways to make money without aiming for control and ownership of everything. I hear what you're saying, and I think that there are some business models that that are more friendly to end users than others, and I think that the combination of technology and regulation and social pressure can all work to build up business models that work for their providers and their users, and that in the longer run, those are the ones that are going to be successful. May we live long enough to get there.
And I would add competition to that, right? Like all free market competition. Netflix was the challenger to the cable networks.
Well, and the thing they did most was wipe out Blockbuster, and now the cable networks are being challenged, although some of their people who own them also own some of the streaming services.
But I would look at all the new ones that are coming out, right? The model isn't set in stone, right? It's not Netflix and everything stops. Yeah. So I would.
I see Rouven also wanting
it's all
to.
going to the consumers not being able to own any movies anymore because DVDs will be unavailable just like VCRs.
So I think, yeah, as mentioned before, so others, I think it's good to have some disruptors because I think it shakes up a little bit the industry, and there are a lot of innovation coming. And you've seen this with certain fintechs and banks now innovated and built a lot of cool stuff on top. I think what your core point is how do we make the technology so agnostic or so that it's empowering that multiple winners, and the network effect is not anymore within one company. So whatever the Facebook effect and others, every person more on Facebook is more value for the network. So what we believe is if we build the network effect into what the web did 30 years ago, is every new computer speaking TCP/IP is a win because you can reach more. So I think what we have seen in the last decade of communication became almost free. Yeah, so you can FaceTime to anyone or WhatsApp call. That's something which we have done, which is great. Now we have built on top very small ecosystem. Yes, you have Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp Messenger and WeChat, and they are not interoperable. But if we're now building what we call Web3, it's so interoperable web layer where you can actually have transactions which are as freely accessible. You can, I think, build network effects into a platform rather than into companies.
At the end of the day, I doubt what's going to wind up out of this is going to be more beneficial to the end user than PayPal, which works very well.
But we can have the discussion offline, but sure.
If the investment banks get involved in it.
Maybe. I don't know whether we need them. That's the point. I think it's a good thing is if you have something which can threaten certain business models, then I'm not saying this as a DB employee. I'm saying this as someone who is working in a very disruptive technology space where we see people and big, many people from banks are joining now and building the new rails of maybe the future. Who knows?
So are there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Thanks. There's multiple mentions of the word education, and a lot of back and forth to do with usability, user interfaces, and sort of the complexity that comes along with the privacy. So when we think about the way in which we're trying to make it so that people can't be correlated in the future, to try to fight against these bad guy big corporates and so forth, what's the way in which, what amount of education would be needed, or is it possible for grandma to deal with grandpa, sorry, you get the idea, to deal with what's going to be either a decentralized identity sort of environment or system of tools or way in which to interact with the modern world for anyone. So Netflix may be super simple, and lots of stuff we use today may be simple, but this stuff doesn't sound so straightforward, and there's going to be a lot of education required. Is that even, how does that look? What's the commentary?
Yeah. I know, I think it is one of the biggest challenges. I think the underlying challenge we've talked about earlier is how do you manage keys? Private keys is one of the biggest challenges to make this in the right combination of user-friendly as well as secure. And it's hard. we can talk about this often. There are good ideas out there. I don't think anyone has the silver bullet to have solved it all. And I think the user experience also, like how do you display, I think the common came of like, what consent do you give actually what you're sharing? I think to make this understandable for anyone is, I think, one of the hardest challenges we are facing.
I think sort of dovetailed into that a little bit is that I think in the last 25 years we've gotten very used to not paying for things. You know, we are the product, and we're not paying for the content that we consume in the way that we used to. We used to buy newspapers, buy books, buy movies, go to the cinema. All of those things had a very tangible exchange of funds for service or goods. And now we're not doing that, so right, and maybe that's okay to pay the content provider, but it changes the model that the content producer has in how they need to make money. It's not that they have to sell ads or sell papers to make money to pay reporters or whatever that they're doing, or producing movies or whatever. It's that they have to monetize you. And to be able to monetize you, they have to get more information about you, which means they have to exploit you more, which means now we need more regulations around these systems that I just want to read a newspaper and now I need regulations around that. It seems very strange, but that's where we ended up.
Piggyback
I want to
on
jump in on
okay,
that.
First, and I also want to jump on that.
Because I think so Jonathan Zittrain and Jack Balkin have raised the idea of data fiduciaries, the notion that those who have special access to our data or access to a lot of our information should be given fiduciary duties to match that access. And just the way we don't expect that every person will have an intimate knowledge of all of the law, but they can hire lawyers to help them engage in legal matters. We should be able to trust that data fiduciaries will do the right thing, and if they don't do the right thing, we should have legal mechanisms to punish them for failure to keep our data safe, to act in our interests. I think we need to act to be able to act through intermediaries, and we need to be able to trust those intermediaries to be acting on our behalf.
But we shift again the problem to one company which can be hacked, or a bunch of companies. So I'm a bit skeptical on that model, because whilst in principle it's better that some fiduciary entity would hold this than maybe someone where it's the product, or where ads is their product. But I'm still somewhat concerned about the concentration of information at one place and under control of one company.
I just want to piggyback on that also, is that the power of the recommendation engine, or the recommendation, for example, Netflix is a strong recommendation engine. And to use your information and to recommend something that is good, great, right, is far superior than a lot of other in the ecosystem. So I think that in some way it's very interesting how the distributed commerce, right? How it's going to pan out, how it's going to, any comments on that? Yeah? I give them Ben first and then come back to Rouven, yeah?
Yeah, sure. So I think it comes back to, I think there's two problems, or there's two issues here that I'd want to separate, right? So the first is, once you've solved the kind of data privacy and safety and soundness issues, right? So
Once you've solved
right. So putting those aside, right? I mean, right. So kind of our North Star, right? So the place most companies are trying to get to when they're innovating, or or starting new businesses and new products or anything like that, they're getting past that small little problem we talked about, right? There's tons of innovation that can come out, right? But right, and it can be using your data for preferences, using your data to make great recommendations, using your data to make your life simpler. There's a million things you can do with that data. as long as kind of the two key things are up front, right? The table stakes are you're keeping your data safe, and hopefully you actually are able to actually understand and track how your data is being used, right? If you can do those two things, if those two things can be accomplished, then the sky's the limit, right? In terms of innovation, I'd be concerned about the companies that have short-circuited the latter to get to the former.
Yeah, so I think one of the questions, like, yes, we want all the personalized experience when we shop or watch movies. But why does it need to be your personalized data associated with my name and my birthday and all the other things? I think what we can think about is models where if I as a user go to a shopping website the first time, I can share lots of what my data without disclosing that it's actually my name or me as an individual. I can have enough let's say, history of the last 10 purchases and my shoe size, whatever. I don't care, I can share this. So I can get a personalized experience on the shopping site. And then in the moment when I actually want to buy, I can give them two pieces of information which can be encrypted. One is like my address and my name, and it's encrypted not against the shop's web address, but it is encrypted against the keys from FedEx and UPS. So the shop knows what I bought, but doesn't know who I am. They give the package to FedEx. FedEx is sending me. They didn't know what preference I had. They don't know what I shopped. They just ship it. And the same with payments. So you can actually segregate, and we can, I think we're now at the place where we can build the same convenience, the same experience without disclosing all of this data in a, let's say, associated to my name way.
And I would agree that that is a great model, but convincing the merchant that they don't need that information is a big hill.
I agree, but it's liability. I think the good thing is with GDPR, if you now get hacked, and we see more and more data breaches, if you get hacked, then you pay up to, I don't know, millions, or I think 2% of your revenue. So there's good reasons why you want to maybe, let's say, have less exposure to my name and my birthday. Why do you need to have it if you don't need it? And but there's like lots of things required to be there, and we need to build this, and then I think we can increase the pressure.
We are going to stop here. I want to thank the wonderful panel of speakers, and thank you. I know with all the speakers, let's give us a round of applause. I just want to, before we stop here, I want to thank the speakers from some of you coming from Canada, from London, Japan, and from California, West Coast. Thank you very much for your time here. I also want to acknowledge Karen Myers from W3C, who has been really contributing to the success of what we see today, this SymposiumX, and also Alan Bird, right, coming in the welcome. I also want to acknowledge a few people before we head up for our networking, and there is a wonderful platter of cheese waiting for you upstairs. And I want to acknowledge a few of the people who are helping in this symposium. They are outside, but starting from Vivek here, and Amalia, and come in and show your face, and Romeo, and Myra. Maybe Myra is upstairs already, all right? So I just want, and Rachel, stand up, please, right? Yeah. And I want to thank our wonderful camera crew, right? Paula and Rick, and thank you so much, right? And I want to thank the wonderful, wonderful audience, all right? Thank you.